Helen Diller Institute provides a rich academic forum for our students, who will be the nation's future leaders, to explore the breadth and complexity of Israel and contemporary Jewish issues. At a time when polarization is more severe than ever, we aim to foster dynamic spaces where students and the wider community can engage in nuanced discourse and thoughtfully exchange ideas. Hanan Alexander, who I'm going to turn to in a second, is our Brett visiting professor in Israel Studies, affiliated with the Helen Diller Institute, and also teaching at UC Berkeley School of Education. He's been in residence for the past 2 years, and hopefully will also be here next academic year as well. And he is a professor of Jewish education at the University of Haifa, soon to be emeritus, and former dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Haifa. So I'm turning to him to introduce our speakers and to say a few words about the program, and then we'll turn it to our speakers.
Thank you, Rebecca. Today is the eve of Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel, Yom HaShoah, which is a day in which in Israel, traditionally there is a siren that's sounded, and the whole country stands for a moment of silence and attention in commemoration of the loss of 6 million of the Jewish people and the destruction of European children. So I'm going to ask that we begin our event this evening by standing with a moment of silence. We don't have a siren. We'll pretend we hear the siren, and each with his own thoughts to remember the Holocaust and its history. It's a real treat for me to introduce this program and these speakers. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to talk about children in relation to Israel, an extraordinarily important topic, especially as we remember the Holocaust, because children allow us to think about the Jewish future, and not only about the tragedies perhaps associated with the Jewish past. When I first came to visit Berkeley, this is my second visit to Berkeley, in 2008, I found that it's really a very small community. I was dying to meet the very famous sociologist Ann Swindler, who had co-authored a number of books that I was very interested in, and finally one of my students arranged a luncheon, and we're going out to lunch, and we're walking down Bancroft Avenue, and she says, "Welcome to Berkeley," and I said, "Well, actually, you sort of could welcome me back to Berkeley, because I was born and raised here." She said, "Oh, really? Are you Ernie Alexander's son?" And I said, "Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I am." She said, "I used to sit next to him in shul." So it's a pleasure, because I've known Sivan recently, but I've actually known her family for a very, very long time. Because your father, Michael, was a dear colleague for the many years that I served at the University of Judaism, now the American Jewish University.
You want to close the door?
But also, Sivan is the Sara Lee Professor of Jewish Education. Sara Lee was one of the great, still is one of the great Jewish educators of our time. A dear friend whose children also happen to be my chanichim, my campers in Judea. So my connection to the family goes way back. So I feel a little bit like I'm welcoming a family member here, sort of like Ann Swindler was welcoming me to Berkeley those many years ago. So Sivan is the Sara Esley Associate Professor of Jewish Education at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, a thought leader in Jewish education and Israel education. Dr. Zakai is the director of the Children's Learning About Israel Project and co-director of Project Orderly, Research and Leadership in Israel Education. She also serves as senior editor of the journal Jewish Education and is a member of the faculty of the Mandel Teachers Institute. She's here to talk about her wonderful new book, My Second Favorite Country, How American Jewish Children Think About Israel, which is a winner of the National Jewish Book Award for Jewish Identity in 2022. And I think an especially important topic for us now, thinking about Israel, given the complexity and the difficulty and the debates that are raging, I think it's appropriate to say, in Israel, even as we speak. And it's also a treat to welcome for the discussion this evening Professor Ronit Stahl, an historian of modern America. Professor Stahl's work focuses on pluralism in American society by examining how politics, law, and religion interact in spaces such as the military and medicine. Her book, Enlisting Faith, How the Military Chaplaincy Shaped Religion and State in Modern America, Harvard University Press, traces the uneven processes through which the military struggled with, encouraged, and regulated religious pluralism over the 20th century. Her current research examines the rise of institutional and corporate rights of conscience in healthcare. It explores how religion has influenced healthcare, as well as how law, politics, and culture have framed religious arguments about medicine, focusing especially on inter- and intra-religious debates that occur within institutions, policy, and public discourse. It's a pleasure to welcome you both, and we look forward to a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm delighted to be here today and to be in conversation with Dr. Sivan Zakai. We're here to talk about her newly published book, My Second Favorite Country, How American Jewish Children Think About Israel, which right here. And I think one of the real delights of this book is that as was just mentioned, it takes children seriously, and it's looking at a cohort of Jewish children from kindergarten to 5th grade to think about how they think about Israel, but also broader topics of politics and civic life. She's looking at American Jewish children thinking about a different country. And so I'm wondering if we can start by asking you about the title of your book and why you chose this title, My Second Favorite Country. What does that mean?
Thank you so much, Ronit, and thank you, Hanan and Rebecca, for those beautiful introductions, and thank you all for taking the time to be here with us this evening. It's lovely to see you. There is a phenomenon that we've known about children since the 1950s. It goes back to the work of Piaget and his disciples, and it has been shown to be true in all sorts of democratic societies, which is that there is a developmental trajectory that children go through as they learn about the world, and in particular, as they learn about the question, what is a country? Which, if you think about it, is actually quite a complicated question. And children in all sorts of democratic societies hit approximately age 8, and they start to say the same thing. My country, the one where I live, is the best country in the whole world. Before kids are 8, they will talk pretty idiosyncratically about countries. So France might be the best country because, listen, the word sounds nice, France. Or Italy might be the best country because my babysitter went there. But once kids hit age 8, they start to say, all around the world, my country is the best country. And when I was doing this research on Jewish children here in California, one of the things that I noticed was at that exact same developmental moment, at age 8, Jewish kids started to say to all sorts of questions, right? I never asked a kid, what is your favorite country? I would say, tell me about the United States. And kids would say, oh, I want to tell you, I have 2 favorite countries. I have a first favorite country, and I have a second favorite country. My first favorite country is the United States. It's the best country in the world. We have freedom for all. And my second favorite country is Israel. And the reason that this is simultaneously totally surprising and also makes perfect sense, from a developmental standpoint, it makes perfect sense. But it's also surprising because for a long time, for decades actually, The research coming out of universities about American Jewish relationships to Israel has told the same story. Young Jews are distant, detached, don't care about Israel, they're ambivalent, they dislike Israel. But actually, if you talk to children, that is not at all true. And kids are saying, my first favorite country is the United States. Totally predictable. But I also have a second favorite country, a place that I think is important in my own Jewish life.
That's really helpful, and actually leads to a question I had at the end of the introduction to your book. You note that it's in childhood, not young adulthood, as you just said, that American Jews are first inducted into communal conversations about Israel. And I was wondering if you can tell us, from your conversations with these kids, what told you that they were embarking or entering this communal conversation?
Yeah. So kids said that quite explicitly. So I want to just take a step back and answer a more fundamental question, which is, who are these kids that I have worked with, and what did I do with them to elicit their ideas? So there's a group of children in the Los Angeles area. All of them identify as Jewish, but not all of their parents identify as Jewish. And they are all kids who are of the same age cohort. They all started kindergarten in the 2012-2013 school year. For those of you who need a reminder about that long, long time ago, kids will say, I was only 5 when you met me, and that was the year that the iPhone 5 came out. That was a long time ago. And I've been following these kids ever since. They are now high school sophomores, 15 and 16 years old, depending on when their birthday falls in the school year. And I've been talking to them year after year after year as they have grown up. Remind me what you're
So just how you could tell that they were thinking that they were entering this communal conversation.
So I did all sorts of things in talking to the kids, some very serious. It's like, you are the expert, and I need you to tell me amazing things about what's happening in your brain. So I would interview kids, and some pretty playful, like I would ask kids to tell me stories. And the amazing thing about childhood development is that two absolutely totally different things that contradict each other are always true at the same time. One of those is that kids are idiosyncratic. Every kid is amazing and special in their own beautiful, unique way. And kids also develop along common developmental trajectories. And that means that there are lots of patterns in the ways that kids talk. And by the time the kids were 5 years old, they were able to tell me in their own words, I care about being part of a Jewish communal conversation. I care about this country called Israel, even if I don't know that much about it. It matters to me. I want to be included in larger conversations that my community is having about what it means to be a Jew living in the United States and about what it means to look to Israel from afar.
When you say Israel, what does that even mean? And I ask this, to your point about countries, I teach college students, and whenever I get to World War I, and we get to the end of European empires and the creation of new nation states, I frequently get a question that's like, well, right, what's a nation state anyways? How is it different than a country? And so I'm curious if you could tell us, in your research, both in your analysis, but also from kids, what is Israel?
Yeah. That is a really great and really complicated question, because Israel is a whole bunch of things at the same time to adults, and it is also a whole bunch of things at the same time to children. It is a geographic location. It is a place in the world. It is also a country, a nation state. Israel also sometimes signifies, especially in both Jewish and Christian theology, a people, right? The people of Israel. And it has a specific government. And it is an imaginary place for children who have never been there before. And it is, in the kind of the language of the Jewish high holiday liturgy, there is a concept that you can have a spiritual Israel and an earthly Israel, one that actually exists in the world on a real plane, and one that only exists in kind of an ideal spiritual world. And children, over the course of elementary school, are able to kind of go back and forth between all of these different ways of thinking about Israel. And when I started this research, I had an even more fundamental question, which is, do they even think that it's a real place? There are all sorts of places that children encounter. Imagine the frozen land of Arendelle in Frozen. That is a kind of a country. It functions like that in children's storytelling, but it's not actually a real place. And in many Jewish educational settings and Jewish communal settings, Israel functions in a similar way. Children have never actually been there. So what's the difference between this place and an imaginary country in a fairy tale? Well, actually, it turns out that by the age of 5, and in many cases even earlier, not in this research, but a separate study I've done on preschool thinking, that idea can emerge in 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, that kids can start to differentiate between countries that exist in fairy tales that don't actually exist in reality, and countries that exist in reality, even if I've never been there.
Thank you. One of the things that gets at is over the course of your research, you've kind of moved backwards in terms of age cohorts of kids and progressively thinking about kids earlier in childhood. And that's part of what makes your work so transformative, is that you're really paying attention to kids, to younger kids, to kids that we often don't, that we might think about in terms of how we relate to them as kids in our lives or their kids in schools. And we, I guess, assume that their teachers know what they're doing. But you're doing something totally different, which is really asking them to give us sort of the X-ray into their brains. Can you tell us a little bit about that choice and about the choice to really pay attention to kids and what these young kids can tell us? You've given us a little bit about how you elicit information, but if we could go a little bit deeper into how you get answers from them, but also what it is they're revealing to you.
Imagine that an alien came down from outer space. And imagine that the alien could speak English and understand everything that you were saying, but knew nothing about life on Earth. How would you explain to the alien what is the United States? How would you explain to the alien what is Judaism? How would you explain to the alien what is Israel? When you ask kids questions like this that are simultaneously playful, but also really serious, right? They get at questions about what makes a community and what makes a country. You will hear kids giving really beautiful, profound answers about the way that they see the world. And the decision to ask children questions like this is both a methodological decision, but it's also an ethical decision that roots children's thinking as central to the work of education and central to the work of any community that is attempting to support children. And children, like any other group of people, are not monolithic, right? So they'll have their own ideas and their own beliefs and their own opinions that evolve over time, that are fluid, that are flexible. But what is constant over time is that if you ask children serious, playful questions like those, and you expect that they will tell you serious, playful answers, they will, and they will give you really profound things. And I just want to say something about how destabilizing that can be for children and for their teachers. It sounds kind of easy, but actually, the mode that happens in most schools and most classrooms, the places where children spend a lot of their time, expects that a question has a right answer, and that the adult knows the answer, and that it is the child's job to learn the answer. And sitting down with children and asking them questions that don't have a right answer, what would you tell the alien? There's no right answer. And saying that it is the child's answer that is the right answer is actually really hard, and it requires children, even 5-year-olds, unlearning some of the patterns in school. When I first started to interview these kids, I had to spend a lot of time saying, I would ask a question like, where is Israel? And they would say, it's 14 hours away by plane, is that right? And I would say, is that right? You're the one who's telling me how you think. So I want to know how you think. And that actually, once you can get kids to do that, it's much harder also to get their teachers to do that. But it recenters what expertise is all about. And it helps us think about children as serious holders or creators, even, of beautiful ideas about the world.
That's super interesting, and I feel like I'm often in a process of trying to get students to unlearn this notion of right answers, which, especially in history education, is a challenge. So you've hinted at some of the reasons this can matter for children's development or their thinking, but can you tell us more about then why this is significant? I've said that this type of research is pretty transformational in terms of how we think about children thinking, but what are the stakes? Why does it matter that we know this?
I think there are two answers to that question. One is rooted in the specific context of the research, which is in the American Jewish community, and the other one is rooted in the specific time in which we are living. So the first answer is about the Jewish community, because the Jewish community in the United States has invested, since the year 2000, unprecedented time, money, and other resources into teaching young American Jews to know about and, in theory, feel connected to the land, state, and people of Israel. And young children are telling me through this research that they are highly dissatisfied with their own education, with the way that their parents talk to them, and with the way that their teachers talk to them, and the way that their clergy talk to them. And I think that suggests that the adults who care about children's learning and development ought to shift the way that we talk to them in profound ways that honors the ways that children think about the world. That is my contextual answer. But there's another answer that is rooted in this particular moment in time, because as everyone who is here today knows, we are living in an era of extreme political polarization. And if you turn to the work of political scientists Alan Abramowitz, he says that one of the amazingly, I think it will make sense intuitively, but one of the things that happens in politically polarized societies is that people actually become more invested in ideas that matter. Why? Because if you sit across the political aisle from me, and I think that your ideas are so very wrong, I am much more invested in bringing my own ideas to the public square to make sure that my ideas win and your ideas lose. And the farther apart we are, the more invested I become. The other thing that happens in politically polarized societies, and we learn this from the work of Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy, is that the more politically polarized society becomes, the more unlikely it is for children to talk about issues that matter for society in the classroom. Why is that? Because the stakes become higher, not only on a society level, but also for teachers. And teachers end up pulling back on having questions that matter about issues in society, especially about issues that implicate policies. How ought we live together in the society? And so at the very moment when young people are increasingly invested in being part of the discourse of society, they get less and less and less practice talking about these issues in their classrooms. And we've known that in high schools, and part of what this research shows is that by the time kids are in third grade, if they don't have educational forum to talk about the issues that matter in their own lives and communities, they don't trust their teachers, they don't trust their parents, and they don't trust the educational process to do what it needs to do to help them be members of their community and society.
So I hear what you're saying about children wanting to be part of these conversations. And part of what you're gesturing toward is that they know what's happening in the world. So can you tell us a little bit about how these California kids are learning about Israel? What do they encounter? And of course, Israel is a rich case study for the Jewish community because of particular attachments, but it's part of what you make an argument for here is this tells us about more than just American Jews, because there are all sorts of topics that children actually know about that we often think they don't. So what is it, what are the mechanisms through which, California kids are learning about a country that at least they might know is 14 hours away by plane, but isn't necessarily a space that some may have direct, intimate contact with, but some have actually never been there?
Ronit, I know that you are a quilter, and so I'm going to use the metaphor of a patchwork quilt for children's learning. Because children, and this happens from the moment they are born, children are collecting ideas and information about the world around them from all sorts of places, and then they're stitching it together from a million different places. So where might children in the United States, in California, learn about a country that's 14 hours away by plane? Well, all sorts of places, but the most important is the internet. The internet is louder in children's ears than their parents, their peers, their teachers, their clergy, in children's own telling of the world. So then, of course, that raises the question, like, how accurate is that? But as kids reach a certain point, and for many kids this happens in 2nd or 3rd grade, kids transition from what literacy specialists call learning to read to reading to learn. And when kids are learning to read, they're learning basic decoding skills, and that takes tremendous effort in children's brains. But once they hit the ability where they can read fluidly, and again, it varies by children, but it often happens in 2nd or 3rd grade, kids do not need adults to tell them information about the world. They can read it on their own, and they have Google, and they will go, and they will search all sorts of things that interest them. So then that raises the question, why would a kid in California even go on Google and search Israel? So I'll tell you my favorite story that a kid told me. He told me this story when he was in 2nd grade. He went out to the California Pizza Kitchen restaurant with his parents and his grandparents. And they were having a really boring conversation about something that doesn't at all matter to children. And so he started zoning out. But there in the corner of the restaurant was a television. The television was on mute, but it was on a news channel. And the ticker tape, he did not know the word ticker tape, but he was able to explain to me that the ticker tape was scrolling, and it said, probably not exactly this, but what he understood it said was, rockets fall in Israel, war in Israel, there are bombs. He asked his grandparent, who was sitting next to him, hey, what's going on? And his grandparent very nicely said, don't worry about it. And so he went home after dinner, after his parents went to bed, and he Google searched what he saw on the ticker tape. And he watched videos. Actually, he saw a rocket attack on Israel, and he was watching it. This was not meant for children, right? Google was not designed for his search. But he was able to use it without any adult help. And that is a lot of how children learn about the world, even as they are also stitching together a little bit of a snippet of an overheard conversation between adults and a thing that he read in his classroom and a parent scrolling on Facebook, and he was looking over the parent's shoulder in all sorts of places. Right? Kids are constructing this patchwork quilt of knowledge from everywhere.
So one of the things I've noticed just a few weeks ago I was teaching in a U.S. history class about segregation and then the integration of Levittown, first planned suburban community, and I found on YouTube, of course, because this is where we find clips from the past, a television interview from 1957 with, a white mother in Levittown worried about the integration of Levittown. And the news reporter asked her, because he elicited that this was about kids, this was about schools. And he asked her, well, do your kids know about this? And her answer was, no, of course not. We're trying to protect kids from this. This is something that should be worked out between adults. And this is the sort of thing that it seems to me comes up all of the time around especially geopolitical conflict, violence. This is for adults, as you just explained, right? The grandparent wants to keep the grandchild away from this information, but the kid's finding it on their own. So can you say more about what it is people perceive that they're protecting kids from, and then what kids are doing with this information that they're discovering on their own without sort of the layer of adults to help them process it?
I do work all the time with parent groups and with teacher groups, and there is a very common belief, especially among those who work with very young children, that it is the job of adults to protect children from the horrors of the world. And it's a totally understandable feeling, right? Because who would want children to know about the rising temperature of our planet, the war in Ukraine, all sorts of, lingering anti-Semitism or rising anti-Semitism, all sorts of bad things that are happening right now. Who would want children to know about that? I think that's a really misguided approach based on how children themselves feel about the world, and I'd like to use the analogy here, not of a quilt, but of sex education. Children are going to learn one way or the other. Adults have choices about how to frame information for children, but they cannot assume that children will not learn information. And with the internet, children have access to all sorts of information all of the time, and now we have ChatGPT, and it makes it even easier for children to find information, misinformation. Children will learn about all sorts of things, and they are, what I hear them telling me is that they are desperate for adults who are willing to say, not, don't worry about that. That is in your example, right? That is an issue that the adults will take care of. But that they are saying instead, I want adults to help me make sense of this messy world in which I am also living, which I will inherit. And kids think about this when it comes to climate change, and they think about it when it comes to all sorts of other issues. Right? You adults are handing me this messed up world. I want to think about it. I'm the one who's going to be living in it.
So can you tell us then a little bit more about how you think about the implications of this? If we first take children seriously as thinkers, if we then realize that they are reckoning with challenging issues that are happening around the world, and third, that they actually want help processing what they're encountering, what does this tell us about education, about parents, about the sort of intergenerational, but also the different kinds of educational contexts that children exist in, but also seek information and analytic assistance from?
I have too many answers to that question, so I'll start, and then I know you'll all have a chance to ask questions. Anyone can ask follow-ups. One of the things that I think what I am learning from children, like what is a practical implication, is for more and better current events education. Children are telling me that they are already following what's happening in the world, but often without sufficient guidance. When children have access to news sources that were designed for children, things like Newsella or Time for Kids, they will read them. But there are all sorts of issues, especially issues that have drama, tension, and especially issues that have violence embedded in them, that those news sites don't touch, right? It will touch an election, but not, say, Ferguson. But kids will know about it, and they'll want to learn about it with adult guidance. So I want to put in a plug for more, better current events education with more robust news sources written at children's reading levels. But I also want to put in a plug for a much larger educational shift where schools are, in my mind, ought not be about transmitting the knowledge that humans have developed over time to children, but helping children think about the world. And that is not what most schools are set up to do right now. Some are, but much more often, schools are places where children learn things that adults know. And children know amazing things, and they think in beautiful ways, and sometimes those ways are very similar to, but not yet at an adult level, and sometimes they're not at all similar to the ways adults think. A kid I recently went back to said, you know, I'm now in high school and we're actually talking about things that matter in the world. It's amazing, and it's 7 years too late. We could do this in elementary school.
So, speaking of the things that students are interested in and what they tell you, I think one of the interesting things about the book that you've written about this is that so many longitudinal studies of kids will write about what they found by age cohort. So in kindergarten, kids say this, in first grade they say this, up through fifth grade. But you made a really different decision about how to organize what you learned from kids, and you have chapters on home, on history, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, on civics, on politics, and actually kids' anger. And so can you tell us about the choices you made in terms of how you've organized this book, but also some of the things you've learned in these specific domains, and how we can then learn what you learned about kids in these specific areas?
When I set out to do this project, which is a longitudinal study focused on children, I didn't know anything about longitudinal research other than that it seemed like a good idea. If we wanted to know how children's ideas developed over time, maybe we should ask children questions again and again over time. One of the conceptually very difficult things about longitudinal research is that the information we have grows exponentially over time. Because if you think about it, kids thinking in kindergarten, and then you're comparing kids thinking in first grade to kids thinking in kindergarten, but then they might be thinking different things at different points in the year in first grade, and you have to compare each of those to how they were thinking at each point in kindergarten. It's actually very hard, and one way that researchers often get around that challenge, as you said, is that they just chunk it by time, right? Here is how kindergartners think, and here is how first graders think, and that's really, really useful for kind of bounding data that has so many different ways of comparing. But the more I listened to the kids in this study, the more I realized that they didn't have a single experience or conception of trying to build knowledge about the United States, Israel, Judaism, and the kinds of questions they were thinking about. It didn't always cut by grade level, and how kids were thinking about historical narrative and what it meant to tell stories about the Jewish past were very, very different than how kids were thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the age points of inflection where they would change or shift their ways of thinking and make major conceptual leaps forward, they didn't line up. And so the more I realized that, the more I realized that this was not a story about kindergartners and first graders and third graders. It was instead a series of stories about how children come to understand what it means to be part of a community, what it means to be part of a society, what it means to be a learner trying to make sense of past, present, and future.
And so, since I'm a historian and I'm doing this interview, I'm going to take my prerogative to ask you specifically about history and how children construct historical narratives, which I think is really interesting because part of what you show in the chapter on history is that students and children are assembling lots of different sort of source material, even if they wouldn't use that term, to construct different kinds of narratives. And frankly, I have trouble sometimes with my college students getting them to think about the different types of narratives we tell and the different stakes of the narratives we tell and the difference and how sort of, as one of my students recently put it, oh, I see different inputs lead to different outputs, like different sources lead to different histories. So I'd like it if you could tell us a little bit more about the kinds of histories children construct and how these change over this kindergarten to 5th grade time period.
So I wrote an entire chapter in this book based on one question that I asked children year after year that became 2 questions. And the question was, tell me a story about how Israel became Israel. And then as kids got into 1st grade, I started asking a second version of the same, what I thought was the same question. If you had to write a book about how Israel became Israel for other children, what would be in the book? And I thought it was just a way to get, sometimes kids, especially young children, don't talk that much in response to any one question, and asking the same question 10 minutes later with different wording will get them to tell you more. And I went for years thinking that I was asking the same question until I had a research assistant, her name was Emma, and she sat down and she said, the kids don't think this is the same question at all. And I thought, but I'm asking the same question. And she said, look again at the data. And when I looked again at the data, I realized that when you asked 5th graders the first question, tell me a story about how Israel became Israel, they were able to weave together a bunch of different kinds of historical narratives. Some came from biblical stories. Some came from rabbinic lore, stories that they had heard probably in their synagogues, and they were often like kind of giving a new gloss to those stories so that they don't exactly match up with any rabbinic text, but the rabbinic text is kind of clearly embedded in that story. And they would tell stories about something I call Jewish heritage narratives, which are these broad brushstroke stories that kind of mirror the Passover story. Jews were in Egypt, and then they were free, and they were in the land of Israel. And they would also tell modern what actual historians would call history, right? Things rooted in historical sources, and they would date those things and say, in 1948 this thing happened, and in 1967 this thing happened. But if you ask them the other question, how would you write a book for other children or tell a story for other children, then 5th graders would, without fail, tell a biblical narrative. And once I realized that kids were actually telling different stories to different prompts, that actually undercuts a lot of what we know about the research on history education, which suggests that 5th graders aren't actually capable of constructing sophisticated historical narratives at all. But if there's a pattern here, and kids are actually telling different kinds of historical stories when they think the audience is different, then actually that is the kind of work that your graduate students or your college students are doing, which is thinking about audience and narrative and telling specific historical narratives to specific audiences. And that is a mighty sophisticated thing that 5th graders can do.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think with and play with the ideas, especially about 5th graders already figuring out how to tell different stories for different audiences, which gets back, I think, to your point about this sophisticated thinking that's going on. And when children tell different stories, not just, of course, of the history, but all sorts of different stories they might tell to parents versus teachers versus their friends, that they are engaging in this way of thinking about the construction of stories, thinking about audience, and thinking about what it is, their own goals in whatever storytelling they're producing. And so I'm using that as a long way to get to the point that, I think that's in some ways, it's fascinating. It's also a little surprising. But then as you're kind of pointing out, things that are surprising when you kind of unpack the layers are often quite explainable, which is that they're learning how to navigate in the world and realizing that different stories told differently for different audiences can be effective for different endpoints. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us then a little bit more about some of the other things that surprised you along the way. What, when you started this study, what did you expect to get out of this process and these interviews? And what along the way, just as your research assistant figured out that actually they're responding to different questions, what along the way made you think differently?
Okay, so the most surprising thing to me was a phenomenon that I noticed once kids hit 3rd grade and then repeated time and again after that point. And in order to understand the phenomenon, I want to back up and make sure that we are all on the same page about a different group of people. And this is a group of people, of Jewish young adults in the United States who are politically progressive and associated with a movement called If Not Now. If Not Now young adults are politically progressive, and they have a campaign, and it's called the You Never Told Me campaign, and it is directed at Jewish institutions, synagogues, youth movements, camps, and schools, saying, I'm really upset, quite furious, that my Jewish education did not teach me about the occupation of the Palestinian people. Now, none of the children in this study are, if not now, young adults. They are children. None of them have ever heard of If Not Now. And yet, by the time they reach 3rd grade, much of their language mirrored, almost word for word, the You Never Told Me campaign of the If Not Now progressive young adults, with 2 differences. One is that I heard this language, you never told me, from children whose parents were politically progressive and from children whose parents were politically conservative. So in the children, it was not just a progressive movement. And the other thing is that children said this about a much broader range of issues beyond occupation. And the most profound story that I heard from any of the children at any point in this study came from a young girl named Gia. Gia went to Israel on a synagogue-sponsored trip with her family when she was in 3rd grade, possibly 2nd grade. And she was really, really excited to go see the Western Wall in Jerusalem. When she had been in preschool, she had gone to a Jewish preschool, and at her Jewish preschool, they took a pretend trip to Israel. And on this pretend trip to Israel, they had gone to the pretend Western Wall, and it was amazing because you could put little wishes on a piece of paper and you could put it in the stones, and then it was like a fairy godmother, and your wish would be granted. And she was so excited to go see the Western Wall in person. That's all she talked about. And then she got there, and she realized for the first time that the space of the Western Wall was not actually laid out like it was in her classroom in the pretend trip she took, because there is a divider between the men's section and the women's section. And the first thing she thought was, the men's section is really big and the women's section is really small, and that's not fair. And then she started to panic. She had an absolute panic attack standing in the plaza leading up to what she had thought was going to be this very special holy site. Because Gia has 2 dads and only brothers, she's the only girl in her family. And she had this thought, I want to touch this wall, I think it's important. Am I going to have to go all by myself without my dads and without my brothers? And she couldn't function in that moment. That moment was so profound for her, even though it probably lasted only a few minutes before her tour guide took her family to another part of the wall called Robinson Arch, where there is a non-gender segregated section. Every year I have known her since, and again, she's in 10th grade now, so every year she has retold me this story as a profoundly transformative moment in her Jewish childhood. And she was not upset about the wall. She was so upset at her teachers in kindergarten or preschool who had given her the wrong impression about that wall, and at her dad's. And one of the most heartbreaking moments happened when she was actually in middle school, so that the book has ended kind of by that time. But she said to me, I think my parents are great. I think they do so much right, except for that. Why didn't they tell me? And I heard stories like that. That is the most heartbreaking one, but I heard stories like that from a lot of children starting in 3rd grade saying, I don't think my own education is sufficient for helping me think about the questions that I think matter in my own life and in my own community. And that is the most surprising thing that I learned from these kids.
So I have 2 follow-up questions to that. One is just about this question of managing expectations, because part of what you're getting at is that children are disappointed. And of course, children can be disappointed about all sorts of things, but as you're saying, in this context, it's heightened because of really high expectations. This is not just about like not getting to go to the zoo because it's raining. This is they really believed in an idea and then the reality was totally different. I imagine this can happen in more mundane ways as well with Israel and with other topics. But what does this tell you as we think about the role of adults, about how we have to think about what we teach, what we talk about, but how we get at kind of helping children realize that that there's a lot of value to imagining the best, but sometimes we have to deal with a lot more complexity. I'll ask that and then I'll follow up with another question.
Yeah, so I'm going to add a question to your question because this is something that sometimes people ask me in tandem with that question. Like, isn't it just a normal part of childhood to be disillusioned with your parents? Like, isn't that just something that happens to everyone growing up? And I think that that's a little bit true, but it doesn't explain this. And the reason it doesn't explain this particular phenomenon, the phenomenon of you never told me, and children's anger, is because once I started hearing these stories, I went back through every single interview, every single storytelling exercise. I did another sort of thing with kids, something called photo and music elicitation. I went back and kind of looked at every example to try and find every instance where a kid said, I'm really mad at the adults in my life. And there were 2 and only 2 contexts in which children expressed anger at their parents and at their teachers whom they really love and respected, right? These are kids who respect, love, and feel supported by their parents and by their teachers in general. And in 2 contexts, they said, I'm really, really angry. One is that we live in a racist society. Like, how come people haven't solved this problem of racism? What is wrong with you adults? I'm really angry about that. And the other has to do with what children experienced as withheld information about Israel, especially about issues of religious pluralism and issues of Palestinian rights and Palestinian identity, where kids were saying, I know that this is happening in the world, why aren't you talking to me about it? And therefore, it's not just about like a little bit of disillusionment with your parents or a natural part of growing up. Children's anger and their expressions of anger, which are clearly directed, are a signal that they want 2 things to change in their own education, right? They're asking for anti-racism education, and they are asking for a much more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of internal political issues, and also, in many kids, telling of the Hebrew language. Many kids want more Hebrew language education as a way of getting access to larger Jewish communal conversations.
This is so fascinating to me because, among other reasons, I also had an experience like this, although I was much older, which is to say this was I remember going to college, my freshman year of college, and then meeting up with my high school friends at Thanksgiving. And several of us were taking Middle Eastern history classes or Israeli history classes or some course that I had gone to a Jewish day school, a Jewish high school. We'd taken a version of it in high school, and then we took a version of it in college. And all of us to a person came back saying, why didn't we learn, in this case it was often like the 1936 Western Wall riots or something, it was more the question of what you might learn in high school, but all of us felt dismayed by things that had been left out that felt actually quite different than the American history education we had got, which seemed much more clear about the challenges of the past. And so I'm also curious if you can contextualize this for us, because they are American kids, they're living in California, so they're interested in racism, but do they see, and I know you've done work on high schoolers thinking about US and Israeli history, is there a phenomenon that goes back to the elementary school in terms of the differences between understanding their first favorite and their second favorite country?
For sure, and it took me a long time to figure that out. And I'll tell you how I figured it out, and then I will circle back to that question. So one of the strangest things that I could not figure out for a very long time was children's explanations of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. As you may know, Netanyahu is a very polarizing figure in Israel, and Netanyahu is a very polarizing figure in the American Jewish community. And yet every single child, without fail, would tell me, I love Netanyahu. He's awesome. And this is true of kids whose own parents are politically centrist, liberal, progressive, and would probably be horrified if they heard their own children talk in that way about Netanyahu. And I couldn't understand, why is it that these kids love Netanyahu? Until the kids started telling me why they didn't understand why I didn't understand that. Because they themselves noticed a gap between how they were being taught about US history, which included education about things like the Trail of Tears and slavery and all sorts of moments that were not so beautiful and not so clean, and people don't always come off looking so good in those stories, right? And how they were learning in their classrooms about Israel in Jewish institutions, in which Israel was the fairy tale land. It was much more beautiful than that and clean. And they thought that Netanyahu was a figurehead of the Jewish people, not a political leader. Kids who were able to say, I have very strong beliefs in the Trump-Clinton election, and here's what I believe, and here's why I believe it, couldn't do that about Netanyahu because they didn't even know that he was a political leader. And they noticed this gap by fourth grade. That's when kids start to develop a political consciousness. Again, that's a little bit different than some of these other inflection points that we have talked about, right? Some things happen in third grade, but the major inflection point that happened in fourth grade is the emerging of a political consciousness and the beginning of an understanding that Israel, like all societies, is a political place. But I am being taught about the United States as a political place. How do I even learn that about Israel?
All right, so I want to ask one last question before opening it to questions from the audience, and that's, what are the questions this study left you thinking about? So for your current and future work, what are you carrying forward or shifting in new directions toward as a result of this research?
So the reason that I started studying about Israel to begin with is because in a study that I had done here in the Bay Area in 2008, approximately, it was not intended to be a study about Israel. It was a study about Jewish education. And one of the things that I noticed in doing that study was that Israel had become a too hot to touch topic in Jewish educational institutions. A kid who was in that study, a high school junior, said to me, Israel is something we're always talking about, but we're never really talking about. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. If there's something that we want to talk about, but we don't know how to talk about, that's worth further investigation. And the more I kind of went down that, the more I realized that we had to start younger and younger. So I did this study on elementary school students. Halfway through, I realized I messed up. I should have started in preschool. I did a study on preschool children's thinking. But the reason that it was interesting to me was because of the contested nature of Israel in Jewish communal spaces. At this moment in time, Israel is no longer the most burning question in the world in which we live. The eroding democratic norms is much, much more difficult. And the way that that plays out in classrooms with growing political polarization on all sorts of issues is much, much more contentious than Israel was ever, I think. And that's saying a lot because Israel is often thought of as the third rail of the American Jewish community. But Israel is only one piece of this larger political polarization. And I want to know how kids think about what issues matter to them in their own communities. The next study that I am launching is going to ask kids to tell me, like, actually what matters to you? And based on some preliminary studies, climate change, how we're going to save this planet matters, and how we're going to figure out how to live together in a politically polarized blue and red America is really, really tough. And children have big ideas about those things also, and that's what I want to learn about.
All right, well, I think we want to open it to questions from the audience. Are we going to pass the mic? Okay, so if you want to raise your hands, we'll listen to your question, and I'll repeat the question to make sure we get it for the recording and Zoom. Okay, so just two questions then. One about the cohort size in the study, and also what kinds of schools, where did you find them?
Okay, so those are really great questions, and I should have said all of that at the very beginning, so my apologies that I did not. It's a small cohort, a group of 35 children. In case that sounds like minuscule, I will say when you do something that is called a cross-sectional study, where you look at children at a specific age and time, you need much, much larger data. When you do longitudinal studies, it is often the case that the data sets are much, much smaller because there's so much to learn from getting kids to develop over time. How did I find these kids is a super, super complicated question. I will give you the really basic version of it, but there's a backstory that has to do with Jewish communal politics that I'm happy to tell if anybody wants to hear it. I started by approaching a set of institutions, both day schools and supplementary schools in the Los Angeles area. The day schools signed up. Most of the day schools did not want to participate. They thought, I don't think I do such a good job with Israel education, so I don't really want you to look at this. The supplementary schools said, oh, that would be so awesome. Then when we got school partners to sign on, we didn't get any participants because you have to get parental consent and children's assent to participate, and you have to get it over time for a long time commitment. We only got parental and children's consent in the day schools. So I started studying these kids. They were all day school kids in kindergarten, but I've been studying them for a long time. Even by first grade, they were in a million different places. So if you look at the kids in kindergarten, they were all in day school. By first grade, there were kids in Jewish day schools, public schools, charter schools. One kid started homeschooling in third grade. Kids go all sorts of places over time, and so there's no simple answer to that question.
Okay. So this is a question about what kind of day schools.
Okay, so there were 3 partner schools who ended up partnering with us in kindergarten. One Reform, one conservative, one non-denominational community school. The schools were also very, very different in the ethnic makeup of the schools. One had a large number of Israeli expatriates. One school was predominantly Ashkenazi families from Eastern European descent, and one school has an incredibly diverse Jewish population with an especially large number of Persian Jewish families. And part of why that matters is because Ethnicity often, though not always, maps onto political ideology in the Jewish community. And so the kids came from politically diverse Jewish families with different kinds of Jewish affiliations denominationally, although all were invested in their children's Jewish education.
All right, several questions here, starting with the technical about how your informants, how you've kind of checked in with them and how they've felt over time, especially now that they're high school students. And then thinking conceptually, recognizing that one of the index entries is loss, but we don't see love. And so thinking about these kind of categories, these analytic categories of loss, but especially of love, and sort of what it means to be invested in these questions, the attention that comes along with it, and kind of thinking about the relationship you have with your informants, their families.
So to the first question about member checks, when this manuscript was finished when the kids were in 8th grade. I have given them all copies of the book, so they all have access to it. None of it is a secret. And I've written many, many articles along the way that their parents also have access to. None is a secret. One parent in particular has given a ton of extra data about her kid, unsolicited, but very, very useful. So I haven't done a member check in that way, but here's what I have done along the way. And I made a special point of giving a lot of time to this as the kids were in 5th and 6th grade. I'm going to write a book about your ideas. What do you think are the most important things that need to go into the book? And you'll see that for anyone who reads this book, not only the title of the book, but the title of every chapter is a title that was given by a child in the study. I often ask, what do you want this book to be about? And the kids' ideas are the ideas that have shaped this. I'm totally struck by your question about love. That is not a conceptual category that I would have thought about. I never asked children a question about love. I was trying to elicit children's ideas and children's feelings. And children have all sorts of feelings, and mixed feelings and big feelings. But if you don't see it in the index, this was done by a professional indexer who goes, I don't know if you know how professional indexers work, but they go paragraph by paragraph and they pick out the words. And so it wasn't an operational category in the children's thinking if it's not there, which might be heartbreaking to their teachers. But it's not how children were thinking. Oh, how much longer am I going to study this particular group of children? They are done. They are bored of me. I don't blame them. I've been asking them literally the same questions word for word for a lot of years. And the pandemic made it really, really hard to keep children's attention. The kids who were willing to talk to me through the heavy years of lockdown of the pandemic, which corresponded to the children's 7th and 8th grade years, where schools throughout Los Angeles were closed for those years. The kids who were willing to talk to me had a lot to say. They had no school, and they were learning more about Israel than ever before because they had so much more time with their computers. But then they didn't want to talk anymore, and then they were done. So I am not still following the kids. I followed them kind of research-wise from kindergarten through 8th grade. Going back to your question, I have developed meaningful relationships with them, so I know what they're up to. I talk to them, but the research is not continuing in high school.
Are you really seeing it that early?
Okay. So this is a question about children's use of the internet. I will say there are other scholars who have found that children's use of the internet to find out information of the world starts even younger than 2nd grade, especially when those children have relatives living in other societies. Kids as young, this is not my own research, but there are other scholars of education who have found that 5 and 6-year-olds, especially when they want to Skype or FaceTime a relative far away, will then use the internet for all sorts of learning about this messy world. Again, in my study, it was in second grade that kids started going and doing independent Google searches. And I have a big spreadsheet on my office wall, like just a hand check of all the different places that I've heard kids tell me that they are learning from the internet about all sorts of very disturbing details about current events. So Google is the prime one, but it's not just Google. The larger question is, what do we do about that? And this study ended before ChatGPT, but a lot of adults and parents are in a tizzy about what it's going to mean now that there's ChatGPT. I'm not that concerned about the internet. I mean, I think it is a tool, and the kids have to learn how to use it. There's a lot of really interesting work being done out of Stanford right now about what it means to teach kids digital literacy. I think that's really important. Kids need to know digital literacy. And the most important thing that kids need to know, and they figure it out on their own if we don't tell them, but how much easier would it be for them if we just told them? The internet is the public square right now. That is where people share ideas. And those are ideas. There's a difference between an idea and a fact, right? But the internet is the loudest place for the sharing of ideas. Kids need to know that from a very early age, and many, many children are not being taught in school how to search the internet, how to use the internet, the kinds of questions that ChatGPT can and cannot answer, the types of questions Google can and cannot answer, right? And so they'll ask Google questions that actually Google doesn't have the answer to, thinking that it does because they don't yet understand that it is a place for the sharing of ideas. But once that clicks in kids' minds, that is a pretty powerful thing, and we could help it click even earlier. Okay, so I think can I restate, where's the line between giving children information to satiate their curiosity and creating a generation of stressed out children? Here's the problem. We already have a generation of stressed out children. And they're stressed out in part because they're learning from the internet instead of from adults who love them and know them and can help them make sense of things that are troubling. So if I had a magic wand, this is a question I often ask children, right? If you had a magic wand and could change something about the world, what would you change? If I had a magic wand and could change something about the world, to me, it's not a line. Right? It's not an either or. Either we give kids information, but then we make them stressed out, or we don't give them information and they're not stressed out. They have all the information. It's on Google. They are stressed out. They need adults to help guide them through that wild wilderness of so much information. Which information is important? How do we process it? I had a kid in a different study, not in this study, a fourth grader, recently tell me, I felt so much better when my teacher finally talked about the war in Ukraine in my class, because I knew about it, but no one was talking about it, so I didn't know how to ask my questions. But then she mentioned it, and I thought I could ask my questions, and now I feel better. To me, it's a coping, like we can help kids cope, not by withholding information from them, but by helping them understand what is it like how do we filter out, how do we not think about it at every single moment? We don't have to think about every bad thing at every moment, right? But also, we can't ignore that. So I don't think it's a line.
Yeah, sorry, I was passing it. So I'm here both as a religious school director for K through 5th grade and also a parent of a 3rd grader. So my question actually is as a parent, why do I feel more comfortable teaching my kid about racism from a really young age, my white kid, than teaching her about the Israel-Palestinian conflict?
Why do I feel more comfortable teaching my own 3rd grader about racism as a white child than I do about teaching my kid about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I don't know. Why do you? So here's the thing I will say. The amazing thing about children is they don't break. I mean, right, you can certainly traumatize a child, but it's not learning about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is going to do that. And it is not learning about racism that's going to do that, right? Those things are going to help them better understand the world and hopefully recreate a better version of the world than the one that we live in now. So I don't know why you as a parent struggle with one and not the other, but I will say that that is a common trend in Jewish communities in the United States. And that is similar to what the kids were telling me about Netanyahu, right? Like, I love Netanyahu because I don't understand he's political, but I want to learn all sorts of political issues because I understand that they matter. And people talk to me about political issues in the United States, but they don't talk to me about other political issues. Political issues matter. They matter to our society. They matter to children living in that society, and children want to think about those, and children are not going to break. In another study, I also studied teachers, not just children. And in a study that I have done about teachers in Jewish schools, I have one participant who is a rabbi who works at a conservative synagogue who said to me, I have two worst fears about teaching my children, the children in my school, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular. My first worst fear, and I hope you can hear the echoes of my first favorite country and my second favorite country, because that's certainly what I thought about when I heard this teacher. My first worst fear is that I will tell them about the conflict and they won't like Israel anymore. And my second worst fear is that I won't tell them, they'll go to college and learn about it, and they won't like me anymore. And like many things, I think that's a false dichotomy, and I also deeply understand that fear, and I think that teacher is giving voice to some of what I hear you say about your own parenting. What kids consistently tell me that they want is not answers. They don't want to know how to solve the conflict. They are not asking, what is the solution to police brutality? They are saying, who in my life, what adult can help me think about what it means to live in a world where this Israeli-Palestinian conflict exists? And that's a different question. And once you can hear that question, I'm hoping it becomes a little easier to talk to your children about it. This is a very well-formulated challenge to me about whether children in California represent or do not represent children in other metropolitan areas or in other areas of the country at all. And I heard you say that there are children in New York, for example, who are sitting in public school classrooms with Arab children, and did I get that right?
Totally aware.
Yeah, totally aware. Okay.
But let's let her respond.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a few things to say. First of all is all research is contextual, always, necessarily, and it's always limited. And so how much can any one child's experience represent any other child's experience, right? I think that is a fair critique, and it is embedded in the nature of the research process. And are there different geographic experiences of children's lives? Of course there are, and we know that to be true. I have not seen a study embedded in the Jewish community that has specifically shown that, but all sorts of other studies have shown that children's experiences living in rural towns versus in cities is different, right? The nature of childhood is always contextual. It is different in different places. Living on the coasts versus living in the center, right? Living in a blue place versus in a red place. So all of these things will necessarily influence children's thinking. And also, California in general, but Los Angeles in particular, is the most diverse Jewish community of anywhere in the world. It has Jews from all sorts of countries who speak all sorts of languages. The kids in this study, I think the parents of the kids were born in maybe 8 or 9 different countries, the grandparents in twice as many places. They spoke many different languages as their first languages in their home and as their second languages in their home. Do they have kind of universal experiences? No, but they have diverse experiences and they also have commonalities. And so when you look at children with diverse experiences who also have commonalities, there's, at least to me, something telling in their commonalities. I would also say all of the children in this study were aware of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They didn't all have the language to talk about it until 2nd grade. They were all aware of its existence starting in kindergarten, and that is true even though they are not sitting necessarily next to Arabs in public school classrooms.
And that was very formative, so I'm curious.
Yeah. So there are scholars of Jewish education. Did any of the children experience anti-Semitism? And you also pointed out about the armed guards in your own Jewish day school education. So there are scholars of Jewish education who study specifically the phenomenon of armed guards in Jewish schools. So take a look at that. I have nothing specific to say about that. I will say that the children in this study were certainly aware of the existence of anti-Semitism by their late elementary school years. I never heard any kid use the word anti-Semitism at all, but I certainly heard kids share with me anti-Semitic events that they experienced as such in their public schools in 4th, 5th, 6th grade, which might be about that moment in time, and it might be about children's development. I don't actually know. One kid in particular talked about wearing a Jewish star to her public school and being told by a teacher that that was an inappropriate symbol to bring into the classroom and that she needed to put it away, that it couldn't come into the classroom. And she was very, very upset and shaken by that. This is the same kid, by the way, who started telling me in 6th grade, I realized that I can't talk to other kids in my school about Israel if I still want to be friends with them. So I'm just never going to talk about Israel in my school. And she was talking both about other Jewish children in her school and about non-Jewish children. This idea, again, that Israel was too hot to talk about in her school.
So I think I'm going to use this as the occasion to wrap us up and to offer a vote of thanks. First of all, to Ronit for bringing this wonderful idea that we should bring Sivan here to campus to talk with us. One of the wonderful things about the Diller Center is it creates the opportunity to talk about Israel in all of its complexity. And I think we had an occasion tonight to hear about how children are thinking about Israel in all of its complexity. And I don't think we should be afraid about that. I want to connect this actually to the question about love. And to the idea of my second favorite country. One of the things that we hope for our children is that they will learn to have the capacity for mature relationships. Mature relationships are relationships in which we're attached to people, we love them, we have close relations with them, but we also learn to recognize that they're not always perfect. Parents, for example, that we might be disappointed in, as Sivan so carefully pointed out, and we don't actually expect the relationship to break or to fall apart because we learn about things that are not as we might have expected. On the contrary, what we hope children will learn in mature relationships is that we need to learn to accept sometimes, to address sometimes, to engage sometimes, but that relationships among family and people that we care about and love involve, in fact, the possibility that they're going to disappoint us and do things that we might not otherwise agree with. So I want to thank Sivan for giving us the opportunity to think about children in a mature way, in a way that engages them holistically, and in a way that engages them seriously, and invites them into our conversations as adults in ways that will enrich us as well as enriching them. And I'm especially grateful to the Diller Center and to Rebecca for the opportunity to bring education and children into our conversation about Israel. It's not an easy thing to do, as we've heard. It's not easy for the kids, it's not easy for us, it's not easy for the campus, but for the same reason of thinking in a mature and sophisticated way about these very important issues in a very divided world, having conversations about Israel in the context of education and thinking about children is extraordinarily important. In California in particular, actually, where the ethnic studies curriculum has become another cause célèbre, point of conflict, point of discussion, and how we think about Israel-Palestine in the California public education system, it becomes all the more important that we find ways, at least here at the university, to be able to talk about these issues without fear, without favor, with a scholarly disposition that enables us to think seriously about them and to bring children into our conversations. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for our wonderful panel for engaging us, and thank you all for being with us.